This is Rick Levine with your October astrological forecast. This forecast is going to be a little bit shorter than usual. Instead, I'm going to make a longer mid-month forecast once I'm back in my home office outside of Seattle. I am in upstate New York right now. And this month, October, is a very intriguing month. There's a lot going on, but it really builds to a crescendo, and more is going on in the second part of the month than at the beginning of the month. And because of that, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be distributing the mid-month update, which normally only goes to my $3 a month patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/Rick Levine. However, this month I'm going to make my mid-month update available to everyone, and I'm going to do a shorter forecast at the front of the month. That would be today. October is an intriguing month because after a few months of not a lot happening astrologically, and when I say that, I don't mean that there hasn't been a lot going on in our lives, in our world. There has. But the astrological energy picks up in October and into the beginning of November quite significantly. And I want to talk about that just as an overview so that we have some understanding of what is coming up. I mean, we do have right now at the end of September and the beginning of October, we're still at the very tightest portion of the recurring square between restraining, constrictive, authoritative, stabilizing Saturn and proactive, rebellious, progressive, futuristic, and inventive Uranus. And this Saturn old, Uranus new square that has been exact 3 times through 2021, beginning around the insurrection in January of 2021. Actually, the first exact square was around the impeachment in February of 2021. And the third and final exact square was the day before Christmas Eve in 2021. However, as we pushed toward the end of September and the beginning of October, Saturn retrograding back into that square doesn't make it exact, but it comes within nearly a half of a degree of being exact. And it holds that position close enough that by the end of October, it's still only a degree from being exact. So that in itself wouldn't necessarily precipitate what's going to or what is unfolding for October and November. But the fact that Jupiter has retrograded back into the midpoint between Saturn and Uranus, that Jupiter is half square Saturn on one side, half square Uranus on the other side, and Jupiter being the magnifying lens, it's exacerbating the dynamic of the extremes between Saturn wanting to hold back and Uranus wanting to bust free. Jupiter, right in that middle point, is making all of this even feel more extreme. And over the end, toward the end, through the middle end of September and into the beginning of October, we've had first Mercury moving directly opposite Jupiter and forming those square and a halves to Saturn and Uranus. First we had Mercury moving through that, then Mercury retrograding back through that point, then the Sun on the equinox, on the autumnal equinox in the northern hemisphere, the sun moving into Libra, and then the sun moving opposite to Jupiter. And that sun moving opposite to Jupiter, extraordinarily powerful at the end of September. And then finally, Venus moving into Libra, Venus moving opposite Jupiter, Venus moving opposite to Jupiter on October 1st. And that means that during these same opening days of October, Venus is forming a square and a half with both Saturn and Uranus, exacerbating that Saturn-Uranus square even more. And then finally, once Mercury turns direct, which it will on October 2nd, Mercury turns direct, having been retrograde now for 3 weeks. Mercury turns direct, and as it turns direct, it will move into Libra on October 10th, and it will then oppose Jupiter on October 12th, and it will also form that sesqui-square, square and a half, with Saturn on the 11th, and with Uranus on the 13th. So we're getting this energy heating up of the dance between the old and the new, the Saturn, the authority, top-down authority, the wanting to go back into the past because the older and the traditional is better, while the Uranus squaring it is pushing forward and making progressive energies kind of pushing up against this. So we have this dynamic in politics, not only in the United States for sure, but in Iran now we have this dynamic which has to do, certainly at least on the surface, with women regaining their rights and the will to have bodily autonomy and either wear traditional garb or not. And of course, this is being reflected in many other places. This stress and tension is also being reflected in storms all around the planet as we end September and open October, with major storms in Alaska, in Taiwan, in Japan, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, certainly in Florida, in the United States. The weather has been certainly incredibly extreme. This is the opening volley for the month of October, which is an extraordinarily potent month. It is a turning point, and we've been in a larger turning point for nearly 2 years now. But this month coming up, October 2022, we not only have Mercury turning direct on October 2nd, but we have Pluto turning direct on October 8th. We have Saturn turning direct on October 23rd. And into all of this, we have Mars turning retrograde the end of the month. And even though Mars doesn't turn retrograde until October 30th, Mars has slowed down so that from October 1st to October 30th, Mars moves barely 5.5 degrees. Now, you can compare that with a typical month where Mars is moving 22 degrees a month. It normally takes Mars about 50 days, a little bit less than 2 months, to move through a complete sign. And it does that for usually 11 signs. And then when it turns retrograde, it'll spend 7 months in a certain area of the sky. And in this time, it will be in Gemini. It will stay in Gemini. Mars actually moved into Gemini on August 20th. And it doesn't leave Gemini to move into Cancer until March 25th. This is 7 months. This is over half a year. And Mars in Gemini is excitable and distractible. We are in this position where energetically we want to do this and we want to do that, but what about that? Oh yeah, let's do that too. And it's easy to take on too much because we can become distracted or attracted to whatever the next cool thing is. So we have this going on with Mars, and because Mars turns retrograde again on October 30th at 25.5 degrees of Gemini, and it backs all the way up to 8 degrees of Gemini, where it'll turn direct on January 12th. What this means is the period or the space between 8 Gemini, where Mars actually reached on September 4th when it entered its shadow, from 8 Gemini on September 4th to 25.5 degrees of Gemini on October 30th, back to 8 degrees of Gemini on January 12th, and then Mars will finally leave its shadow, or mid-March on March 15th, Mars will leave its shadow at, again, 25.5 degrees of Gemini. What this means is that if you have a planet between 8 and 25 degrees of Gemini, Mars is going to go once, backwards twice, and then forward 3 times over that planet, energizing, kicking its butt. Normally, the way it only does that once for a few days, once every other year, but now it's going to hang out in that part of the sky and activate that planet. And in fact, if you have a planet at 8 degrees of any mutable sign, Gemini being a mutable sign, Sagittarius the opposite sign, and the squares Virgo and Pisces, anyone that has any planets between 8 and 25 degrees of Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces is going to have those conjunction squares or oppositions from Mars during this retrograde phase. If, however, you have a planet during those degrees from 8 to 25 of Libra or Aquarius, because Mars moving through Gemini air sign will trine those degrees in Aquarius and in Libra, here the stress is actually more productive and easier to manage. So watch in your own charts where that Mars retrograde is hitting, because even though it doesn't turn retrograde until October 30th, we're going to be feeling it all month, because when a planet slows down, it gains power. And Mars only moving 5 degrees over the entire month, it's holding energy, it's holding power, and in fact, we will have the Sun forming a trine with Mars on October 17th, and Venus forming a trine with Mars on the 18th. We will have Mercury forming a trine with Mars on the 26th of October. And all of these days are days that the energy might feel like it's flowing smoother than it normally does. But keep in mind that October is a month of dynamic change. And again, we'll step through the month rather quickly, but we're taking a little bit of a different approach as we look ahead to the month of October, because it's such a potent month filled with so much dramatic change. There's 4 planets that station, and again, just to recap, that's Mercury, Pluto, and Saturn all turning direct, and Mars turning retrograde. On top of that, we have several planets changing signs. Obviously, the Sun, which changes signs every month. The Sun moves into Scorpio on October 23rd. Along with Venus, the same day, the Sun and Venus are traveling together at that point in time. But we also have Mercury, which has retrograded back into Virgo. and we mentioned this earlier, that Mercury will go direct into Libra on October 10th, but Mercury really picks up speed quickly, and Mercury direct then moves into Scorpio on the 29th, moving through Libra rather quickly. And so we have a lot of planetary changes, including Jupiter, which has been retrograding at the beginning of the month. Jupiter retrograde is at 3 degrees of Aries, but by October 28th, Jupiter retrogrades back into Pisces, its home sign, its domicile, which may give us another round of being able to sink into our hopes and our dreams and Jupiter in Aries is like, we're ready to do things that are new. We're excited about new ideas and new projects and taking initiative, which is all very cool. But when Jupiter retrogrades back into Pisces from the end of October through the end of the year, Jupiter will move back into Aries again late December. But we get a couple of months of it back in Pisces, and that can really help us sink in to our feelings in a way that maybe right now we're more motivated toward action. And remember, Mars in Gemini is motivated toward action. And another thing about that Mars in Gemini this month is that Mars will make a square to Neptune on October 12th. Remember, Mars is going to move forward, retrograde, and back over those degrees. So Mars is going to be squaring Neptune 3 times between October 12th and March, when it finally moves out of its shadow, and it'll square Neptune for the third and final time. And this is a bit of confusion. This is a bit of uncertainty, a little bit of maybe feeling a bit lost even. So we begin the month with that Venus opposing Jupiter that I mentioned earlier on October 1st. And on October 2nd, Mercury makes its station, turning direct. On October 6th, Mercury makes a trine with Pluto, and this is Mercury's third and final trine with Pluto that has been over the past month and will continue to be bringing secrets out into the open, dredging deep Mercury into the intellect, into the shadow realms, Pluto, and bringing them out into the open where we can't help but see them and have to deal with them as fact. On October 7th, the Sun opposes Chiron. This can be an awareness when it comes to our own human shortcomings. It can be a time when we reach out to others to help them to heal in relationships where we're healing someone that may have to do with our own personal wounds, but often we, with Chiron, the wounded healer, amongst other things, a teacher also, certainly, we reach out to others and we heal in them what hurts in us to perhaps prevent others from needing to feel the pain that we actually feel. And that opposition from the Sun to Chiron is significant because the Sun is still within orb at the full moon on October 9th at 4:54 p.m. Eastern Time, and that's 1:54 p.m. Pacific Time, and that is the Aries Full Moon. The Aries Full Moon is significant because it is conjoined to Chiron. It is conjunct Chiron, as the Sun is opposed Chiron still, and Venus is moving closer and closer to the Sun, catching up to it, and so we have a Venus-Sun conjunction opposing the Moon Chiron, which I think can be tremendously healing, although it might not be fully comfortable. The saving grace about this full moon opposition between not only the Sun in relationship-oriented Libra with Venus in her home sign lined up with the Sun, both of them opposed Chiron in Aries with the moon, with the full moon conjoining it. This might normally be a bit more difficult, but the Sun and Venus are both moving toward a grand air trine with Saturn in Aquarius and Mars in Gemini. Remember, at the end of September, I think on the 27th, we had Mars making an exact trine with Saturn, and Mars is moving so slowly that trine from Mars to Saturn pretty much holds all month, which means that as planets move through mid-air, through mid-Libra, they are going to be trining Saturn first and then trining Mars, making a very smooth intellectual process where I think diplomacy can really reign strong, and that is so needed because there's so much stress and tension that are being held by both the Saturn-Uranus square with the Jupiter semi-squares exacerbating it, plus that Mars slowing down and getting ready to turn retrograde, heating up as anger kind of becomes, more closer and closer to the surface. So I think that this Aries full moon is not quite as hot-headed as an Aries moon might normally be. It's soothed, I think, a bit by its opposition to Venus and by this rather logical and rational grand air trine. On top of that, I mentioned earlier also that Mercury is trining Pluto, and although that Mercury trine Pluto is exact on October 6th, it's still in play by the time of the full moon on October 9th. By October 11th, the Sun now moves into trining Saturn, where that's that grand trine that we were talking about. The Sun trines Saturn on the 11th, and then the Sun trines Mars on the 17th. Meanwhile, Venus is doing the same thing, trining Saturn on October 14th, and Venus will then trine Mars. Venus will trine Mars on the 18th. And so we have this whole repeating scenario of planets moving through that mid-Libra, trining Saturn and then trining Mars. In fact, later in the month, Mercury will do the same thing. Mercury will trine Saturn on October 22nd and trine Mars on October 26th. And again and again and again, we're getting this intellectual, self-referential kind of closed-circuit thinking that I think can be very sound logic, but it also can be very dangerous because we can think that what we're saying, or someone can think that what they are saying is absolutely logical and sound, when the fact of the matter is that it could just be self-referential crazy stuff. So we need to be careful, because remember, we have Mars square Neptune that is in play for months, but is exact also on October 12th. Incidentally, the predominant squares for the month, as these planets move through Libra, I mean, there is that square of Mars to Neptune, but we also have the Sun, Venus, and Mercury each making a square to Pluto, again, each bringing out information and or feelings and or actions that have been hidden. And yet, because these are squares, not the trines that we were talking about last month and even back on October 6th when Mercury was trining Pluto, but through October we have the Sun squaring Pluto on October 19th, Venus squaring Pluto on October 20th, and Mercury squaring Pluto on October 27th. These are all a bit more difficult to deal with because they're squares, and the information and or the behavior and or the desires that are brought out into the open may be more difficult to integrate. So that actually brings us through the middle of the month. We do have the exact Venus conjunct the Sun. That's a Venus cazimi, the Venus in the heart of the Sun, on October 22nd, and that's at 5:17 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 2:17 Pacific Time. Also on the 23rd, we have Saturn making its station direct. In a way, what this means is that Saturn isn't closing in on that square to Uranus anymore, but it's not separating very quickly. So we still have that Saturn-Uranus cooking all through the month of October. And in fact, the other important thing that happens in October is we get the first of two eclipses, this being eclipse season, just talking about how dynamic the month is. The first of the eclipses is on October 25th. That's a Scorpio New Moon solar eclipse at 3:48 a.m. Pacific Time. And then the following eclipse, although it's not until November, is a very powerful one for two reasons. Well, more than that. But number one, it's on the morning of Election Day in the United States. And the eclipse, the full moon eclipse, the full moon eclipse is, how do I want to say this? The eclipsed full moon is conjunct Uranus while the moon is being eclipsed, and it's opposed Mercury. So we have Mercury lined up with the Sun, opposed Moon lined up with Uranus, and this is shock, awe, surprise information. Mercury coming out that is surprising for Election Day. It's hard to tell what this actually means in advance. This can fall either way, but I think it's going to be a surprise whatever happens. And that eclipse we'll talk more about when we get to the mid-month update that, as I said earlier, I'll be distributing widely for no charge for everyone. But the actual solar eclipse, the new moon eclipse that occurs on the 25th, is also very interesting because the Sun has moved into Scorpio, and this is a Scorpio solar eclipse, and it's conjunct Venus, which is very sweet, and yet Venus in Scorpio is in its exile. It's as far away from its home sign Taurus as it can get. And so we have a bit of difficulty, negativity to deal with. However, there are a couple of saving graces. In particular, Mercury is coming up to trine Mars, which gives us the ability to communicate, Mercury, about our boundaries, about our anger, about our passion, Mars. And remember, historically, Mars was associated or ruled both Aries and Scorpio. But when Pluto was given to Scorpio, it's almost like Mars lost the lover, the passion side, and instead just became the warrior. But in fact, Mars is about passion. It can be the passion so great that one will go to war for love of family or a person or an idea or country. And with this Mars trining Mercury at the time of the of this eclipse, this solar eclipse in Scorpio, this is a very, very powerful eclipse. And I think that this is also part of the changing of the guard. You know, we've seen already in the United Kingdom, in England, Great Britain, we've seen the changing of the royal family there. And I think that we're seeing the beginnings, the turning point that I said earlier, of the power structure here in the United States. What that means, where it'll go, how it'll unfold, time will tell. And I'm not completely sure. But I am sure that there is a deep and profound change going on that will become more observable not only after the October 25th eclipse, but more importantly after the November 8th lunar eclipse on election day. So this, like I said, is a totally exciting month. With so many planets changing signs, with planets turning retrograde and direct, with the beginning of the eclipse season, certainly Mercury making its station and turning direct. Things might feel like they're moving forward as Mercury takes a few days and even a week to begin its charge forward. But the thing is because that's Mercury charging forward. But because Mars has slowed down so much, it's not moving forward very quickly at all. Even though it's in a fast sign, Gemini, that Mars, because it's moving forward so slowly, it might feel like it was last month, like we're going nowhere fast. Things are really, really moving, but it might feel like we're not making the progress that we think we should be making. And all I can say is we are. It's just not obvious yet. It's like standing in the ocean up to your knees and the tide's coming in. But every time a big wave comes in, you can feel the drag pulling out on your feet at the bottom, because there are currents within currents. And although the obvious current that we'll be feeling on the surface is that Mercury turning direct and Mercury, feeling like we're being finally released to move into the future, and yet with Mars going so slowly, it's like there's anchors on our feet that are holding us in position, not letting us move quickly forward quickly. And in fact, as Mars turns retrograde, the end of October and continues its retrograde motion all through November and all through December and halfway through January. Again, Mars finally turns direct on January 12th. And during this whole period of time, even though the other outer planets one by one are turning direct, in October we have Saturn turning direct and Pluto turning direct, and then over the following months we will have Jupiter turning direct and Chiron turning direct and Uranus turning direct, and then even Neptune turning direct. But with Mars going backwards, or apparently backwards, it still feels like we're dragging our heels. And the only image that I could come up with to kind of explain this in a way that could make sense is that although Election Day occurs the beginning of November, just at the beginning of the Mars retrograde phase, it's not until the elected officials in the United States take office in January, and when Mars turns direct in January, and Mars doesn't move out of its shadow until March, meaning that we're going to have to give whatever the new political regime is time to begin to move forward. And so it's going to take us really until next February, March, April to really be in ultimately new ground and new territory. So that's the lay of the land. And like I said, this month's forecast was a little different because I really wanted to focus on how profound and powerful a month this is, especially compared to the last couple of months that have felt like, even though there's been stress and unease, and even though people are on edge, we're all feeling like we can't take much more of not knowing what we're doing or where we're going. There's that stress and tension from the Saturn square Uranus that's being exacerbated by Jupiter and the planets moving opposite from Jupiter, that this stuff is going to begin to fade away, and we're going to actually begin to get real movement, but we're still not moving as quickly as we want to. Nevertheless, October is a turning point. It's a point at which important things occur, and it's a point at which if we don't show up, and if we, how do I want to say this positively? It's a time when we actually must show up with our values. Why values? It's that it's the new moon, the solar eclipse that's conjunct Venus, the planet of what we like, of what our values are. And if we don't show up with integrity to actually push for what our values are, and if we then don't get what we want out of the election, unfortunately, we deserve it. That's a little bit harsh, but the point is that whatever it is that you believe in, that this is a time to actually act on those beliefs. You know, I say almost every month, almost every time I go on YouTube, I remind us to think cosmically. That's what astrologers do, but to act locally. And yet I think more than ever, it's a time to act locally, because we have an opportunity on the planet over these next few weeks. And by the time we get to November and December, it's like the energy is going to solidify the way it is, and we're not going to have as much ability to make the changes that we can actually stand up for and make now. And it might seem overwhelming, it might seem like we're not getting what we need or what we want, but that makes it even more important for us to speak our piece now, to speak it loudly, to put money where we can behind our beliefs, because unfortunately, at least in the United States, so much of the political process is determined by who can spend the most. And of course, there are many candidates who are intensely and heavily funded by either the oil industry or the petroleum industry, or by the pharmaceutical industry, or so on, that it's really important for us to show up with our nickels and dimes and dollars and $10 bills and put that money behind candidates that we feel will do the right thing rather than do the thing that they've been paid to do by big business. So that's it. I'm off my high horse. But I think that October is hugely significant, and I'm going to encourage all of you to pay attention to the planetary movements. I'm also going to encourage all of you to come back mid-month around the 15th, when I will publish my October mid-month update, which will also include the beginning of November, because those two eclipses, the eclipses on October 26th and November 8th, will really work hand in hand. So it's October 25th, I think I said 26th, October 25th and November 8th, because those two eclipses will work hand in hand, and there's a huge amount of change coming down the road, and we can either be at effect, in other words, whatever happens and changes, it will be what we have to deal with, or we can be causal, meaning we can participate, jump in, and to help make the changes that we believe are important for us to experience at this time. That's it. I'm going to close with my my infamous byline, and that's think cosmically, act locally. That's what's important right now. I will see you all mid-month, mid-October, and until then, be kind, be compassionate, be aware. I'm Rick Levine.